For several seconds, Harold could not breathe. The noise inside the courthouse faded into a distant blur, while his eyes remained locked on the paper in Keanu's hand. Paid in full. The words felt impossible, unreal, like something spoken in a dream moments before waking. Evelyn's knees nearly gave out beneath her. "You're... what?" she whispered shakily. Keanu's expression stayed calm. "The house belongs to you." Behind them, reporters continued shouting questions, camera flashes exploding across the room like lightning. But Keanu paid no attention to any of it. His focus never left the elderly couple standing in front of him. Harold stared at him in disbelief. "Why would you do that for us?" The question hung heavily in the air. Keanu glanced briefly toward the courthouse windows where cold rain had begun, falling again outside, because some things shouldn't be taken away, simple words. But something inside them carried deep truth. Evelyn suddenly covered her mouth and began crying openly. Years of fear, exhaustion, and helplessness poured out of her all at once. Harold wrapped his arms around her while his own tears silently escaped. Around them, the entire courthouse stood frozen. Even the investors looked uncomfortable now. One reporter lowered her camera slowly, visibly emotional. Keanu gently placed the folded receipt into Harold's trembling hands. "Go home," he said softly. "It's yours." Harold looked down at the paper again like he still could not fully trust reality. "I don't know how to thank you." Keanu gave the faintest smile. "You already did." Before Harold could ask what he meant, Keanu turned and quietly walked away through the stunned crowd. Reporters rushed after him immediately. "Keanu, was this planned? Are you starting a charity? Why this couple?" But he ignored every question. Outside, rain poured steadily across the courthouse steps as Keanu climbed onto his motorcycle. For one brief moment, he looked back through the courthouse doors toward Harold and Evelyn standing together beneath the harsh fluorescent lights. Then he rode away into the storm. The story spread across town within hours. By evening, nearly every television station in the country carried the headline, "Keanu Reeves saves elderly couple from..." Losing their home. People online called it unbelievable. Some called it kindness. Others called it a publicity stunt. But Harold and Evelyn didn't care what the world thought. For the first time in months, they drove home without the crushing weight of foreclosure hanging over them. The truck rolled slowly down the muddy road as rain softened into mist. Neither of them spoke much. They were too emotionally exhausted to fully process what had happened. When the old house finally appeared at the edge of the property, Evelyn suddenly began crying again. The porch light still glowed weakly through the fog. Home. Still. Home. Harold shut off the truck engine but remained gripping the steering wheel for several long seconds. "Thought we lost it," he admitted quietly. Evelyn reached for his hand. So did I. When they stepped inside, the familiar creak of the floorboards sounded different somehow. Warmer. Alive. Again, Evelyn touched the living room wall gently as tears slid down her cheeks. "Can't believe we're still here." Harold looked around the dim room slowly. The peeling wallpaper, the patched furniture, the old clock ticking unevenly in the corner. For the first time in a long while, none of it looked broken to him. It looked loved. The next morning, Harold woke early to the sound of vehicles outside. At first, he feared the bank had returned, but when he opened the front door, he froze in confusion. Several trucks were parked near the house. Men unloaded lumber, ladders, paint supplies, and toolboxes while others carefully examined the roof and porch. Harold blinked. "What's going on?" One worker smiled politely. "We're here for the repairs." "Repairs?" A familiar motorcycle engine rumbled softly behind them. Harold turned. Keanu removed his helmet and walked toward the porch carrying 2 bags of groceries in one hand and a small bouquet of fresh flowers in the other. Evelyn appeared behind Harold wearing her robe. Equally stunned, "You came back," she whispered. Keanu handed her the flowers gently. Figured the garden deserved another chance too. Evelyn stared down at the flowers as emotion overwhelmed her again. Harold looked toward the workers. You hired all these people? Keanu nodded simply. Roof leaks in 3 places. Porch foundations unstable. Wiring needs replacement. Harold laughed softly in disbelief. You already checked all that? I noticed. There was no pride in the way he said it, only care. Throughout the day, the property slowly transformed into something it had not felt like in years. Alive. Hammers echoed across the yard. Workers repaired broken shutters. Rotten wood disappeared. Electricians fixed dangerous wiring while landscapers carefully cleared weeds choking Evelyn's. Garden neighbors gathered quietly, across the street watching in amazement. Some looked ashamed. They had never helped sooner. Inside the house, Evelyn carefully unpacked groceries Keanu had brought. Fresh bread, soup ingredients, fruit, coffee, medicine. Medicine. Her hands paused instantly. There were arthritis prescriptions inside the bag. Tears blurred her vision again. Meanwhile, Harold led Keanu into the small detached workshop behind the house. Dust covered nearly every surface. Half-finished wooden toys sat abandoned on shelves beside rusted tools. Harold lowered his eyes. Used to build things out here. Keanu ran his fingers lightly across one of the carved wooden trains. These are incredible. Nobody really buys handmade stuff anymore. Keanu looked around slowly. That's not why you made them. Harold swallowed hard. For several long seconds, silence filled the workshop. Then Harold quietly admitted something he had not spoken aloud in years. I built toys for my daughter in here. His voice weakened. After she died, I stopped coming out, Keanu. Said nothing. He didn't interrupt. Didn't offer empty comfort. He simply stood beside the old man in understanding silence. Harold's eyes drifted toward an unfinished music box sitting in the corner beneath. Dust. His chest tightened painfully. I thought if I stopped. Touching her things, he whispered. Maybe losing her would hurt less. Keanu looked at him gently. Did it? Harold's eyes filled instantly. No. For the first time in years, he sat down at the old workbench again and quietly cried. The workshop stayed quiet long after Harold's tears stopped, as if even the dust refused to disturb him. Sunlight filtered through the small cracked window above the workbench, falling in thin golden lines across unfinished wood and forgotten tools. Outside, the sound of repair work continued faintly. Hammers, footsteps, voices. But in here, time felt slower, heavier, honest. Harold sat with his elbows resting on his knees, staring at the half-carved music box in front of him. His hands hovered near it but didn't touch it yet, like he was afraid it might break something inside him that had only just started to heal. Beside him, Keanu Reeves remained silent. Not impatient. Not distracted. Just present. That silence mattered more than words. After a long moment, Harold finally reached out and placed his fingers on the music box. Dust clung to his skin as he carefully lifted it, turning it over like he was seeing it for the first time in years. I started this for her 7th birthday, he said quietly. Never finished it. His voice cracked slightly, but he didn't stop. She used to sit right there. He nodded toward a small wooden stool in the corner, and watch me work. She always said the music boxes felt like tiny memories you could open. A faint, broken smile crossed his face. Keanu looked toward the stool, as if he could almost see her there. Harold swallowed hard. After she passed, I couldn't finish anything anymore. The words hung in the air like something fragile. Keanu finally spoke softly. Sometimes unfinished things aren't broken. They're just waiting. Harold glanced at him, unsure. Waiting for what? But he didn't ask. Because for the first time in years, something inside him wasn't pushing the thought away. It was listening. Outside the workshop, Evelyn stood at the edge of the garden with her hands wrapped around a warm mug of tea. The workers had cleared a large portion of the yard, revealing soil that hadn't seen sunlight in years. Some of the old rose bushes were still alive beneath the weeds. She knelt slowly beside them, brushing dirt away with trembling fingers. One tiny green bud had survived. Just one. And she cried again, not from pain this time, but from something dangerously close to hope. Inside the house, life was quietly returning. Electric lights no longer flickered. Warmth filled rooms that had been cold for too long. The smell of fresh paint mixed with baked bread from the kitchen, where someone had helped Evelyn cook for the first time in years. But what unsettled the town most was not the repairs. It was Keanu Reeves himself. He didn't behave like someone who had saved a house. He behaved like someone who belonged there. That evening, as the sun lowered behind the hills, Keanu walked with Harold through the backyard. The air smelled of wet soil and new beginnings. Workers were finishing up for the day, packing tools into trucks. Harold stopped near the center of the yard. "This used to be a tree," he said quietly. Keanu looked at the empty patch of ground. "What happened to it?" "Lightning," Harold replied. "Years ago. We kept the stump for a while. Then it rotted away." He looked down at the soil. It felt like everything good here was disappearing piece by piece. Keanu nodded slowly. Then, without speaking for a moment, he looked toward the workers loading equipment. "Can you plant something here again?" Harold blinked. "Like what?" Keanu thought for a moment. "Something that grows slowly. Something that lasts." A pause. Then Harold gave a faint, uncertain nod. "Maybe a tree." Keanu smiled slightly. "Not maybe." That night, something unusual happened in the Carter house. For the first time in years, Evelyn cooked a real dinner, not out of necessity, but choice. Harold sat at the table without staring at bills. The clock in the corner ticked steadily, as if it had finally remembered how to keep time properly. Keanu didn't eat much. He mostly listened. Evelyn talked more than she had in months. About their daughter. About the early years in the house. About small memories that had almost been buried under years of survival. Harold listened too. Really listened. At one point, Evelyn laughed softly, an unexpected sound that made her pause, as if she wasn't sure she was allowed to still make it. "I forgot what it felt like to sit like this," she admitted. Harold reached across the table and took her hand. "So did I." Later that night, after the couple had gone to bed, Keanu stepped outside alone. The sky was clear now, stars visible above the quiet town. He stood in the yard where the old tree had once been. Behind him, the house glowed softly with warm light. For a long time, he didn't move. Then he pulled out his phone and made a call. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I need something built here. Not big, not flashy, just right." A pause. Then he added, "And I want it named after her." The next morning, Harold woke early to the sound of digging outside. When he stepped onto the porch, he froze. A foundation was being laid in the backyard. Workers were planting something new. At the center stood Keanu, sleeves rolled up, holding a shovel covered in dirt. And as Harold watched in stunned silence, Keanu looked up and said simply, "We're building you a place where nothing gets lost again, Harold, eh?" Didn't move for a long moment. He just stood on the porch, gripping the wooden railing as if the ground beneath him had shifted into something unfamiliar. The morning air was cool, carrying the smell of fresh soil and sawdust. In the backyard, workers moved with steady purpose, measuring, leveling, marking lines that didn't exist here the day before. At the center of it all was a foundation taking shape where nothing had stood for years, a new beginning being carved into old pain. Evelyn appeared beside, Harold in a thin shawl, her hair slightly undone, eyes still heavy with sleep. But the moment she saw the activity outside, she froze just like he had. "What is this?" she whispered. Harold didn't answer immediately. His throat felt tight. Down below, Keanu looked up from the pit he was helping level. Dirt clung to his boots, sleeves rolled to his elbows. Completely unbothered by the fact that cameras were no longer present, and no one was watching anymore except the people who mattered. He raised a hand in greeting. Evelyn's breath caught. "He's building something?" Harold finally stepped off the porch slowly, as if afraid the moment might disappear if he moved too quickly. Workers paused briefly when they noticed the couple, but Keanu motioned for them to continue. "This isn't a house," he said as Harold approached. Not really. Harold frowned slightly. Then what is it? Keanu wiped his hands on a cloth and gestured toward the foundation. A place where things get remembered. Evelyn walked closer, eyes scanning the outline forming in the ground. It wasn't large. Not a mansion. Not something extravagant. But it had intention. Every corner, every marked space felt deliberate. Harold crouched near the edge of the foundation and ran his fingers through the fresh soil. You didn't have to do this, he said. Quietly, Keanu looked at him for a moment before replying. I know, that. Simple answer made Harold look up. There was no pride in Keanu's voice. No need for recognition, only certainty. Evelyn knelt beside Harold, her hand trembling slightly as she touched the ground. What is it for? She asked softly. Keanu's gaze shifted toward the old house behind them. For what you lost. A silence followed that felt deeper than words. Across town, people were already talking again. Word had spread quickly that Keanu Reeves wasn't just repairing the Carter home. He was building something new entirely. Some called it a memorial. Others called it charity. A few called it unnecessary, but none of those words fit what was actually happening. Inside the Carter house, something else was changing too. Harold slowly walked back into the workshop alone, later that morning. The unfinished music box still sat on the workbench where he had left it the day before. But now it looked different to him, not abandoned. Paused. He sat down, picked up a small carving tool, and hesitated. His hands still trembled slightly. For years, he had convinced himself that touching these things again would reopen wounds that had finally started to scar over. But now the wound felt different. Not fresh, not bleeding, just real. Behind him, footsteps approached. Keanu stepped into the workshop quietly. You don't have to finish it today, he said. Harold didn't look up. I don't even know if I remember how. Keanu leaned against the doorway. Then start by not remembering the end. Harold finally looked at him. What does that mean? Keanu thought for a moment, choosing his words carefully. It means, don't build it for how it ends. Build it for how it felt before it stopped. That stayed with Harold longer than he expected. Outside, Evelyn stood near the garden watching something unexpected happen. The single surviving rose bush, the one she had cried over days earlier, had begun to open more. Not fully yet, but enough to show color returning. A worker passing by noticed her staring at it. Looks like it made it, he said kindly. Evelyn nodded slowly. Yes, she whispered. It did. That afternoon, something shifted in the town. Neighbors who had once only watched began to come closer. Not reporters, not investors, just people. One brought seedlings, another brought tools. Someone else brought food for the workers. No one spoke about why anymore. They just helped. By sunset, the foundation in the backyard had become something more defined. Walls beginning to rise, framing a structure that still didn't fully reveal its purpose. Harold and Evelyn stood together watching it from their porch. For the first time in years, they weren't isolated. They were surrounded. Harold squeezed Evelyn's hand gently. I don't think we're losing anything anymore, he said. Evelyn leaned her head lightly against his shoulder. I think, she replied, we're just starting to understand what we still have. Behind them, Keanu stood quietly for a moment longer, watching the half-built structure catch the last light of the day. Then he turned toward the couple and said something that made both of them go still. When this is finished, he said softly, you're going to hear her again. Evelyn's eyes filled instantly. Harold's breath caught. And for the first time, neither of them asked what he meant. Because somehow, they already believed him. The days that followed felt different in a way no one in the Carter house could properly explain. It wasn't just the construction in the backyard, or the steady rhythm of work that replaced silence. It wasn't even the way neighbors now walked past slower, sometimes stopping to watch instead of looking away. It was the feeling that something invisible had been gently placed back into their lives. Something they didn't know they were still allowed to have. Hope. Harold woke one morning to the sound of soft tapping at the workshop door. He expected a worker asking for tools or instructions. Instead, when he opened it, he found Keanu standing there holding 2 cups of coffee. No announcement. No ceremony. Just coffee. Harold gave a faint, tired smile. You don't sleep much, do you? Keanu handed him a cup. Sometimes. They stood in silence for a moment, looking toward the backyard where the structure had grown overnight. Wooden frames now formed clear outlines, small rooms, open spaces, a design that didn't resemble a house or a business. It resembled something else entirely, something personal. Evelyn appeared shortly after, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. Her eyes immediately softened when she saw Keanu. You're here early again, she said gently. He nodded once. There's a lot left to do. Harold took a sip of coffee. You still haven't told us what this place is. Keanu looked toward the structure. It's not meant to replace your home, he said. It's meant to hold what your home carried. Evelyn frowned slightly. I don't understand. Keanu paused, as if choosing whether the truth would hurt or heal. Then he said quietly, Memories don't belong inside collapsing walls. A long silence followed. Even the wind seemed to slow. That afternoon, something unexpected arrived at the Carter house. A small group of strangers. Not workers. Not reporters. People from the town carrying photos, letters, and small objects wrapped carefully in cloth. One elderly woman brought a faded photograph of her late husband. A man brought a broken pocket watch. A young woman brought a child's drawing she had found in her attic years ago. Evelyn stood at the door, confused. What is all this? She asked softly. The woman holding the photograph stepped forward. We heard what he's building, she said, nodding toward the backyard. We wanted to add something. Harold stepped closer, visibly unsure. To what? The man with the pocket watch answered quietly. To remembering people we don't talk about anymore. Evelyn's hand trembled slightly as she accepted the items being offered. Each object carried weight, not physical but emotional, stories, loss, love that had nowhere else to go. By evening, the structure in the backyard had changed again. What once looked like framing now resembled a small open hall. Walls partially enclosed but never fully closed. Light passed through it freely. Every beam, every space felt intentional, designed not to trap memory but to hold it gently. Harold stood inside it for the first time just before sunset. Keanu was already there, adjusting a wooden beam with quiet focus. Harold looked around slowly. This isn't a house, he said again, softer this time. Keanu nodded. No. Evelyn stepped inside behind them, her eyes widening slightly as she took in the space. It felt peaceful. Strangely peaceful, like grief had been given somewhere to sit without being pushed away. Harold ran his hand along one of the wooden posts. Why here? He asked. Keanu finally looked at him directly. Because your home survived everything it shouldn't have, he said. And so did you. That evening, the sun dipped low behind the hills, casting warm orange light through the unfinished structure. Shadows stretched gently across the ground, not dark or heavy, but soft. Evelyn stood in the center of it and closed her eyes. For a moment, she didn't hear construction. She didn't hear town noise. She didn't hear worry. She heard laughter, small, familiar, like a memory brushing past her. Her eyes opened quickly, breath catching. Did you hear that? She asked softly. Harold turned toward her immediately. Hear what? She hesitated, then shook her head slowly, almost afraid to say it out loud. Nothing, she whispered. But Keanu, standing slightly behind them, looked up toward the fading sky as if he had heard it too. Weeks passed. The structure was completed, not as a replacement for the Carter home, but as something separate yet deeply connected. A quiet, open space filled with objects, memories, stories donated by the town, and fragments of lives once forgotten. People began calling it the Memory Hall. One morning, Harold and Evelyn walked through it together as sunlight filtered through its open beams. Every corner carried meaning now. Every item told a story. Harold stopped near a small wooden display where his daughter's unfinished music box now sat, carefully restored but intentionally left incomplete. Evelyn placed her hand over her heart. "I don't feel like she's gone here," she said softly. Harold nodded slowly. "Neither do I." At the far end of the hall, Keanu stood quietly watching them. For the first time, he wasn't building anything. He was simply observing what had been built. Evelyn walked toward him, eyes filled but calm. "You gave us more than a house," she said. Keanu shook his head slightly. "I didn't give it to you." A pause. "You already had it. I just helped you see it again." Harold joined them then, standing beside Evelyn. The three of them looked around the space in silence. Not sadness, not loss. Something else entirely. Understanding. And as the wind passed gently through the open hall, carrying light across every memory within it, the town outside slowly began to change too. Not because one man had saved a house, but because someone had finally reminded them that nothing truly loved ever disappears completely. Not even time.